For today's history video, I'd like to talk about the history of the women's suffrage that culminated in the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote. Ironically, the women's suffrage movement piggybacked on the abolitionist movement and the effort to give freed slaves the right to vote, and then piggybacked on the temperance movement to ban alcoholic beverages. And then, having been frustrated by both of those movements, essentially went out on its own and achieved the right to vote after a struggle of 70 or 80 years. Initially, it was thought by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucy Stone, the early leaders of the suffrage movement, that the 14th Amendment that guaranteed U.S. citizens equal protection of the law and due process, coupled with the 15th Amendment that said that U.S. citizens their right to vote could not be abridged because of race, would lead to a judicial decision, giving women the right to vote. And it was not to be. The court refused to, and it became very clear that the existing abolitionist movement would enfranchise black men, but not black women or white women or women of any race. That was really kind of a body blow to the suffrage movement. And it revived around the 1880s through the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was seeking to have prohibition of sale of alcoholic beverages. The theory was that women needed the vote in order to get their husbands to stop drinking, to enact prohibition so that they wouldn't drink away their paychecks and leave the women destitute. Women at the time had very little in the way of property rights. In fact, a woman who was employed found that her salary was her husband's property. And in that environment, women existed largely by the sufferance of men. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union allied with the suffrage movement. But it soon became clear that the Christian temperance movement wanted prohibition and would take it even without women's suffrage. So the suffrage movement was really on its own. Two new women stepped in, Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt, who basically took over rival factions of the suffrage movement. Catt focused on getting state-by-state enactment of suffrage, not as part of a constitutional amendment, but because states control who can vote in that state, she felt she could get all of the states to grant women the right to vote. And she went state by state with highly organized, very aggressive referenda to get the vote for women. Initially, she was very successful in the western states, the frontier states, where there were very few women. The frontiersmen really valued them and wanted to attract more women by granting them rights. And eventually 9 of the western states on their own granted suffrage to women. Catt continued her efforts, ultimately winning a referendum in New York State, and New York and New Jersey became the only states east of the Mississippi that granted women the right to vote. And New York became one of the only states that granted women the right to vote. At the same time, Alice Paul, who had been trained in Britain under the suffragettes there, Parkingham, the famous leader of the suffrage movement, had trained her in civil disobedience and nonviolent protest, and she was determined to bring those lessons to the United States. As the 20th century dawned, the progressive era took hold in American politics. Theodore Roosevelt became president, followed by Taft, and followed by Wilson. And as politics moved to the left, there began to become an increasing agitation for women's suffrage, backed up by Catt's victories at the state level. Around 1913 and 14, when Wilson took office, Alice Paul ratcheted up the stakes and engaged in direct action, nonviolent picketing, to urge and push for women's suffrage. She set up a permanent picket line around the White House that was manned 24/7 and was constantly badgering the president to let Americans vote. when World War I happened and the U.S. got into it in 1917, the women in particular kept asking, how can you fight for democracy and liberty abroad when you deny it to women at home? That got under Wilson's skin, and gradually and slowly he began to embrace suffrage, a cause that he previously had spurned. Meantime, the D.C. cops did their share, and the Capitol Police. They were savage to the women pickets, arresting them one after the other. They were then hauled to trial, given the choice of 5 days and then 30 days and then 90 days in prison or paying a fine, and they all refused to pay the fine and went to prison. At one point, there was a special workhouse for women from those picket lines, and they were brutally treated. When they went on hunger strikes, they were force-fed, which was agonizing and also caused permanent damage to their digestive system. And the stories of the brutal treatment of these women, many of whom were of high standing in society, began to get out into the media. And the hunger strikes became a big cause throughout the United States and really spread support for suffrage far more broadly than it had been before. In the presidential election of 1916, Wilson and the Republican candidate Charles Evans Hughes were under heavy pressure to support suffrage, and both did tepidly, Hughes a little bit more aggressively, and Wilson would talk a good game on suffrage, but then would do nothing about it. Finally, in 1917, after Wilson was reelected, he overtly urged Congress to go with suffrage. And when women began to work in war industries and serve in supportive roles in the military, there was more and more agitation to grant them the right to vote. Finally, in 1918, the House passed women's suffrage by 1 vote, and it went to the Senate, where it died. It was never brought up for a vote, and they were 2 votes short of passing it, so they never brought it to the floor. But the next session, the House passed it rather heavily, now with a Republican majority that was more committed to suffrage than the Democrats were, and it went to the Senate, where it passed by 1 or 2 vote margin, and then was ratified by the various states. The toughest ratification battle was the last one in Tennessee to become the 36th state to ratify the constitutional amendment. And it was a bitter fight between the pro and anti-suffragettes, and it was resolved when a Tennessee state legislator said that his mother had instructed him to vote for the amendment, and based on that he was switching his vote to pro-ratification, and that was the vote that put it over the top. If you want a full history of this, Eleanor Clift, C-L-I-F-T, has a wonderful book out about it that she wrote about 10 years ago that I just read the other day. Thank you.